Thank you. Oh, it is so nice to call to order this regular special meeting of the Ascension Parish Council on September the 30th in this building. We have all endured the challenges of video meetings, and we are grateful to be back, able to be together, and certainly on this very special occasion where we get to hear from the Kinda-Keist folks about the work that they're doing for us and for the administration. So I call to order this meeting. I'm going to ask Coach if he would please lead us in the prayer and the pledge to follow.
Let's bow our heads. Most Heavenly Father, as we come at this hour in the evening, Lord, we want to say thank you for allowing us to be here tonight. We pray, Lord, that you guide this meeting, direct all of the councilmen. I pray, Lord, that you continue to bless our president. We ask, Lord, that you continue to bless this parish of Ascension. We ask, Lord, that you allow us to have a great meeting tonight. I pray, Lord, for the families that are suffering. I pray, Lord, for the families that have made it out of the storm. We ask, Lord, that you continue to bless this parish of Ascension. In your name we pray. God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, let's see. Councilman Ogeron is not here. Councilman Mason is not here, and Councilman Turner has just arrived. Thank you. All right. There is a public comment period. If you would like to speak on this item, then in just a moment, if you will have gotten one of those green or red cards and get it over to Cinnamon, the secretary for the council, she will get it to me, and I will call upon you to speak. You'll have 3 minutes at the appropriate time. So once again, I want to welcome everybody back into the building. Thank you guys for being here tonight. I think this is going to be very interesting. I want to thank the administration and the Kinda-Keist folks for getting us their presentation in advance. It was very helpful to be able to look at that, be kind of prepared for what we'll see tonight. So thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. I wanted to ask the speaker, would you like to hear the presentation before you speak, or would you like to do that afterwards? We can be flexible tonight. Okay, that's fine. Mrs. Catherine Delatte.
So a little over a year ago, there was a strategic planning committee meeting where a relatively new member to the council presented a proposal with a compelling and subject matter expert-backed argument to require 20-foot roadways for any proposed residential subdivision. My own councilman from District 10 and another new council member were notably silent and refused to second that motion to forward the proposed legislation to the full council. The parish president, in a letter to residents January 15th of this year, stated that while he believed Ascension Parish absolutely needs revised development codes, he did not have the authority to do so. And he was pretty much of the opinion that the 6-person majority on this council seemed to be lacking any sense of urgency to bring those needed changes about. So here we are. And I just have a couple of questions for all of you to think about as we get ready to view this presentation, which comes with it a huge outlay of money. apparently, $350,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. Will you commit to extending the moratorium if the next phase of the growth management strategy is not completed within that time, which we don't think it will be? This phase will draft regulations to implement the recommended actions, and if you aren't willing to extend the moratorium, then why spend $350,000? Because if you won't commit to extending the moratorium on new subdivisions until page 2 is complete, then why are we here? Because it appears as though, from looking at it, that phase 2 is going to go into 23. Otherwise, it seems to be an enormous expense for naught. I mean, the 2020 traffic master plan doesn't even call for widening Highway 73 until 2023. Yet here we are with how many new homes approved to add to already existing gridlock traffic on that roadway. Because we all know how reliable a traffic impact study done during the height of COVID, how reliable that traffic study is. Because the only people who were actually on the roads at that time during the height of COVID were doctors and nurses like myself. Everybody else was at home, not making traffic like they are today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lapp. All right, gentlemen, we are ready for you.
Good evening, Parish Council members and staff and public. I'm Brett Keast. I'm the CEO and owner of Kindig Keast Collaborative. And I have with me tonight Tariq Wafai. And Tariq will be giving a presentation and I will be interjecting along the way. We have been doing this work. I particularly been doing this work for 32 years in cities, towns, parishes, counties, all across the U.S. We thoroughly enjoy the work we do, and what we enjoy most about this is working with folks like yourself to help find solutions to the problems that have been rearing their head for many, many years, and we've been very successful at this. So we look forward to having the same success here in Ascension Parish. We know that this will not be without question. We know there will be issues brought up. We know that perhaps we won't all agree on all of the solutions. But I will say that we are here to work with you, to work with the residents and the businesses of this parish to help find solutions. Particularly on the scope that we've laid out, we are very well aware of the moratorium that you have, the timing of that. So we have scoped and scheduled this first phase of work to provide you interim deliverables, which will be focused on the biggest issues of growth management and the necessary regulatory changes or additions that are necessary that come forward through this process. We, however, think that without taking a look at the full code, it's kind of like trying to replace your pipes without removing the drywall. You know, we really have to get into the code and look at all aspects of it and make sure that all the development-related regulations and policies and plans speak to one another, and they're all synced so that there's no confusion when somebody comes to this parish to develop. It's very clear to them what the requirements are and what's required of them to make application. It's our philosophy that we want to create regulations that provide the type of development that you all expect. It's our job to figure out what that development is. What does that look like? And we shouldn't have to go through an extraordinary and cumbersome process to deliver what all of us want at the end of the day. So in that, we can be clear about where the parish is going to set the bar, what's required of development, and spelling it out in clear black and white so that anybody that is wanting to develop or redevelop or expand or whatever they want to do in this parish, they understand what the expectations are and they're prepared to meet those expectations. Oftentimes it's talked about, simplifying the regulations. And most people think that means we're cutting out pages. We're making it shorter. But in fact, it's kind of the opposite, because we want folks to be able to read and understand what the requirements are clearly and not have a lot of gray areas or a lot of voids or silence in the ordinance that creates problems for them, and it creates uncertainty and unpredictability for them. If we want to support the economy of this parish, we want to support economic development, but not at the compromise of the character of this parish and those things that are the reason that you've chosen to live and invest here. So it's a careful balancing act. So we want to work closely with you to get into these regulations, to understand all the plans, to understand the policies, the conversations, the discussions, to work with your community to understand what their perspectives are, what they think should be done or shouldn't be done, and come together recognizing that we're going to develop a code that we can all come to agreement. It's not going to be perfect for every single person, but we want to bring it to the place where we can all agree with it and we can adopt it and we can move forward. We have a long record of getting our codes adopted, like 99% over our careers. So it's very, very important to us that we're successful on your behalf. So I just ask you tonight to please begin this collaboration, this work with us. Ask us questions. We're an open book. We want to be everything above board. We want to be transparent, and we want to communicate with all the people who have interest in this project. I appreciate with the gal that's here tonight, because that starts to educate us. It starts to inform us of some of those perspectives that are out there, and all those matter. So we appreciate your time this evening, and we'll give the presentation. We've created certain places where we can pause to have you ask us questions so that we can respond to those. We want this to be a conversation, so we want to answer all your questions. We don't want to leave tonight without you having all your questions answered. We want you to be comfortable. We realize that this is an investment, a much needed investment, but nonetheless, it's important that you're comfortable and confident that we will work with you to reach the milestone that we're all aiming for during this moratorium and then beyond. So with that, I will let Tariq begin the presentation, and then we'll pause and answer or ask for questions.
Thanks, Brett. What he said. I double that sentiment. Very nice to be here in front of you in person. Just like you, we are tired of Zoom meetings as well. And this is what we do best, interacting with the community, driving the streets, really seeing what's on the ground. And that's very difficult to do from Google Earth and talking to you all on Zoom. So thank you again for the invitation and for spending another night in September to join us this evening. So appreciate that. Just a quick overview of tonight's agenda. We're going to spend some time just going through the growth management summary. I'll call it a recap. It's a recap of what we did for you, I believe it was August 19th when we met with you all remotely, just to remind you why we're here, why we're doing this phase one of the project, and how we got to where we are tonight. We'll get into a little bit of the weeds in the critique of your current regulatory framework, and then some of the recommendations that we have for moving forward. I will tell you that there is a lot of meat on the bone in this presentation, too much meat to go through every single bullet point with you tonight. Draw me out if you'd like to learn more, but on some of these I'm going to keep it fairly high level. Others I will go in and dive deeper where I start seeing head nodding and additional questions and things like that. And then again, like Brett said, we've got time for questions as we go through the slides. And then at the end, we'd like to shift to the second item on the agenda, and we will provide kind of an overview of phase two implementation, the letter proposal that you received, and we can give you a high-level summary of what was included in there, why it was included in there, and how we see ourselves as partnering with you over the next 18 months or so. So let's dive in. Description of the goals. We've got to do this right out of the gate. Why are we talking about growth management? Because you need policies that are appropriate for the parish. You're coming on the heels of the master land use plan. This process is not to reinvent that wheel or revisit adopted policies that are already on the books, but rather to say, all right, we know what those are. How do we carry you to the next level? We're looking at the code for effectiveness at managing the growth today. the code that's on the books today. How is it performing? And I will just tell you anecdotally, you've got a lot of good foundations in place in the code. This is not a throw the baby out with the bathwater. Terrible way to say it. We don't have to start from scratch. You've got a lot of good things in place today that we can build on, but we think you could make some improvements. We identified gaps, overlaps, and inconsistencies among some of your current policies, and incorporated best practices. What are some of the other folks, what are neighboring jurisdictions doing? What are the other parishes doing? What are some of the other cities and towns doing that you might learn from? Not necessarily a cut and paste job, but let's talk to them. Let's start the dialogue and find out what worked, why did it work, what didn't work, and why did it not work. And then talk about targeted code updates, especially, that you could implement quickly prior to the 9-month moratorium. I'll go into details on that when we get to the phase 2 scope of work. The bottom line is we want you to eventually adopt new regulations that would help you better manage growth. So this current phase of the project, remember we talked to you about the growth implications. That was last month. Tonight we're going to be presenting our critique of the current code and recommendations for action incorporating those best practices. We also spent the last month or so developing the scope of work for putting those actions onto paper before summer 2023. And again, you saw that in the letter proposal. I'll walk through some of the details. Before we dive in, just a reminder, we're not going to start the dialogue on a no growth fundamental or unchecked growth fundamental either. Rather, we'd like to focus on the terms at the top there: responsible growth, growing where it's appropriate to do so and where you have infrastructure in place to do so and level of service to accommodate said growth. Sustainable growth. How are we doing it in a way that not just makes it a higher quality of life for your residents who get bogged down in traffic when they are out there on the roads now, but also protecting natural resources, protecting the character of the rural character of what makes up most of the parish. And then fiscal responsibility. How do you find funding mechanisms that make decisions easier for you as to where to spend money on capital projects, where you need to accommodate more growth, and how do you direct resources towards those areas effectively? And we hope you saw that in our letter proposal, that we're actually bringing in a sub-consultant to focus just on that piece to help inform that conversation. You've experienced a lot of growth over the last decade. And I think, in speaking with some of you before the meeting tonight, the decade before this last decade was even more growth than what you experienced the last decade. So you've been on a tear, right? And you've seen a lot of change. That could be a good thing. With change and with growth comes economic development. It can be a very good thing for the parish, good for the municipalities within the parish. But it can also be very scary, especially when we're not thinking about the impacts of that growth and how those are wreaking havoc on the residents, wreaking havoc on staff, and on all of you for making it challenging to make decisions. The pattern of recent growth has included a lot of disconnected residential developments. I'm not going to go through those slides from last month again, but I showed you images from 2010 and then 2021, and just comparing where have you seen a lot of that residential development, and it's scattered. And sometimes it's thoughtful, oftentimes it's not that thoughtful. And oftentimes you're creating bottlenecks that if you had a better regulatory schematic in place, it would have been easier to say no. Let's find a better way to do things to make sure that we're maintaining that quality of life. Now, the Capital Region Planning Commission, these statistics were in the Master Land Use Plan, but this is a regional effort. This isn't just parish specific, but they said for Ascension Parish to expect a lot more growth over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Now, the parish has a certain holding capacity, right? You can only grow so much, given the infrastructure you have in place today, given the financial limitations you have in place. You certainly can't accommodate growth on top of what you're able to do beyond that holding capacity. But let's be prepared to talk about if you were to grow, either at the level predicted by the Capital Regional Planning Commission or at some other level, higher or lower than that number, how is the parish going to respond? Do you have the menu of options in place to make good decisions and make sure that you're able to say no when it's not appropriate and able to say yes when it is? We know that there's limited available land to accommodate any growth in the parish. A lot of that having to do with wetlands, floodplains, areas that are already developed, areas within cities that are reaching their capacity too, agricultural areas, all sorts of reasons. When we take that land away from future growth potential, then there's not much area left to grow. So we want to be wise and thoughtful about how we apply regulations to those areas. And strengthening the standards within those areas is going to be crucial to our success, crucial to your success as a parish to get the regs right. We'll get into details here quickly. I think this is my last slide on recap. Let's talk about the benefits. I mentioned you have an available holding capacity, and managing within that capacity is essential. The less far-flung infrastructure, and by far-flung, I mean having it so far from where you actually want development to occur, that's going to mean less expense by the parish to maintain. So if we can encourage developments to be closer to one another and to be more compact where it makes sense to be more compact, you're spending less money at the front end. You're spending less money in the long run to maintain those pipes, roads, traffic issues, all of those things that are difficult on the parish. We want to protect rural and natural resources as much as possible, and focusing areas of development on neighborhood hubs and centers that would be really good opportunities for a mix of uses allows you to do just that. It allows you to protect land on the fringe, protect land from development that otherwise has a lot of pressure right now. And then being sensitive to natural hazard risk. We've got some ways that we want to recommend in this slideshow to talk about how we can think about water a little bit stronger. Not just how it moves across the land and through the land, how it percolates into the land, but how we're making sure that homes and businesses are not in harm's way as you continue to grow. So what can a code do to help manage growth? We've talked about a lot of the quality of life issues and reasons for managing growth and how quickly you have been growing. Well, a code can require mixed-use development. Maybe not in every zoning district. You have mixed-use zoning right now. We could help it be used more frequently. Encouraging mixed use, we can do that through zoning tactics. We can make it by right instead of having to ask for approval every time you want to do a project that the council has already agreed that it is a good idea in certain areas. We can set the intensity of new developments with open space requirements or incentives. I'll talk a lot about that tonight, later on. Establishing lot sizes that discourage sprawl. And that means smaller lots in some places, but not everywhere. It means larger lots on the fringe, right? Let's maintain that rural character instead of dicing it up and make sure that we're doing that in a coordinated approach. Requiring adequate public facilities. This is not a new concept to you. It's not a new concept to Louisiana. It's not a new concept to the surrounding parishes. But it's an area where you need a better ordinance in place to help you get there, to help manage level of service, not just with traffic, but for sewer and other infrastructure as well. So here we go into our critique and some of the recommendations. The first being to rework the residential zoning districts for more permanent open space in exchange for a density bonus. Now, we're not saying that every developer should get a density bonus in every location within the parish. Rather, we're saying you have a certain number of zoning districts on the books today. Most communities that we work in, you end up having to consolidate zoning districts or remove zoning districts because they've sliced the bologna so thin over time that there's no need for all of those zoning districts. I believe we have the opposite problem here, in which you're trying to accomplish too many things with too few zoning districts. How do we set aside districts that truly are intended to protect rural character instead of calling it rural character and suggesting that they develop over time? And so there are ways to do that. Our primary recommendation here is to add countryside districts, rural districts, and estate districts. You have some of those today, but basing each of those new zoning districts on different character development types. And I've listed them up on the screen there at the bottom with their pictures. These are not parish-specific diagrams. These are just a way to visualize what that might look like. Within a countryside district, you might have conventional development. You may have conservation development. And these grow from the least dense on the left-hand side to the most dense and intense on the right-hand side. However, there's more land protected as you move left to right. So even though we've got a conventional system there, it's a lot lower density on the left-hand side. There's very little yellow remaining there, or open area that's been protected, because it's all been developed and disturbed. As we move to the right and think more about clustering and conservation, put the like activities next to each other, protecting what's on the outside or protecting areas within the development. It helps for a lot of reasons, not just protecting beautiful things, but helping with water and storm drainage issues as well. So let's get into what that could look like. There's a lot of detail here, and you don't have to understand everything in the table, but I do just want to walk through an example with you. The left-hand column, far left-hand column, is the land use plan designation. So those come out of your policy documents on the books. You've got a policy that says we care about rural, residential, and open space areas, and those have been identified. Your current districts, you've got conservation, rural, and medium residential, or the R-M, which a lot of land in the parish is zoned R-M. We're suggesting a new countryside district. Let's walk through that so we can see how this table works. This would be a new zoning district, and it would have two types of development options. Remember the 4 flavors that we described on this previous slide. So this would have 2 of those flavors, conventional development and conservation. The minimum lot area for the conventional zoning district would be 20 acres in size. And so you're going to have developments like that, right? People are always going to want to parcel out the land in larger parcels, maybe have farming activities on part of the land, a home, outbuildings on the other part of the land. No requirement to have open space protection there, but a max density of 0.05 dwelling units per acre with no development bonus. Now, if you're willing to do what we're calling a conservation type development in that same countryside zoning district, then you could go as small as 18,000 square foot lots, so a little less than half an acre. Percentage open space, 95%. And the density bonus is twice the density. So you're getting 0.1 DUs per acre at those lot sizes, but protecting an awful lot more land around the edges. Now, we think that's really appropriate as we start to look at the current zoning map. All of that area in green that you see right here, that might be appropriate for a countryside zoning district, where you would say, we're not talking about no growth in those areas, but first of all, you're going to have to go through, if it's wetlands and floodplains, there are going to be other issues that need to be addressed by engineering standards, subdivision standards, any additional ordinances we put into place. But just from a zoning perspective, let's not zone those for future development. Let's think about countryside. And what does that mean? It means a lot less density in those areas should somebody come to you and want to start chopping it up and do residential development. So back to this table, I'm not going to go through each of these suggested zoning districts, but you can see by the time we get to the more dense, version of residential neighborhood through the medium residential, the RM zoning district. At that point, we're suggesting 4 different flavors of the residential medium zoning district. And then you've got conventional, cluster, and as you can see, your density goes up in each one of those scenarios. The amount of land protected with open space, and by the way, when you draft open space requirements, don't just say as a point in time, we want 20% open space if you're going to do this development. No, that's permanent open space. And so we can talk to you about how to put those on a spectrum of options, how to dedicate that space permanently in perpetuity, how to consider other areas where you might want to put a timeline on those open areas if you think there's a need for further development in a certain area at some point. And now's a good point to actually pause for a minute, just because I said something that reminded me. When we draft regulations, Ken Keast, our philosophy is not to bring you one solution and say, here's the thing. Do you want the thing? It's not binary like that. Rather, it's only fair to come to you and say, here is an approach to rework the zoning districts. Here's another approach to rework the zoning districts that is either more aggressive or less aggressive, more progressive, less progressive, more aligned with your policy making or less aligned, and you tell us which direction you want to go. We don't have skin in the game, right? You live and control this parish, and so we want to be partners with you to get you there. And so I want you to remind us as we continue to work together to bring you those options on a spectrum rather than saying, here is the only way that something can work.
Yeah, I'm going to interject real quickly and then want to have some questions because we've been going for a while here. The first thing we do is we look at your current zoning and we model those so we understand your engineers and your developers and your landowners. We understand the densities that they're getting out of those. We want to make sure that we're not penalizing them. That's not our job, right? We can get the folks that are in that business on board with this concept because we look at what densities they're getting now and we find ways that we can give them that density and then we give them options that can give them even more density. We're not saying they have to. We're saying here's a menu of different development options within this district. Whichever one of these makes the most sense for you based upon the encumbrances on that land, if there's floodplains or whatever there might be, or based upon market or housing type or whatever you're trying to go for, you can make your own decisions. We're just simply saying we're going to lock in the character of that. So if we want to be rural, that doesn't mean it has to be undeveloped forever. That means it can be developed, but it has to be developed, like Tarek was saying, with 95% open space. So it's going to stay rural, but you can develop. So people can get value out of their land. So there's a lot of ways we can do that. So I just want everybody to understand that we're very careful in respecting the development interests and the property interests that they have for their land and finding solutions so that it gives them an option. So we're not saying these things are off the table forever. So let us pause here because we've been going on for quite some time and ask what questions you have thus far on the materials that we've presented. Anything that's...
So I'll be acknowledging Councilman Lawler and then Councilman Melanson and any other questions that may come up. I see Councilman Waggis back too. So it's all working, guys. It's lighting up with little numbers. All right, so Councilman Lawler.
Thank you all. First of all, great start to the presentation. This is really interesting information that we're getting. One of the questions I have is, and we've seen this already, and I'm sure y'all have seen it elsewhere, so I'm looking for y'all to help us find solutions to this. When we develop a neighborhood, and I'm looking at the cluster, the conservation, all of those, there's this public space. What we've run across is the homeowner association has to take care of it, and if you don't have a strong homeowner association, it doesn't get taken care of. And we have that with ponds, we have that with open space. How do we remedy that? Is that something that you have experience with? And I'm not necessarily looking for an answer now, but I really want to keep that on our minds because this cluster idea looks really cool. You have a big open space in the middle, but if it becomes a haven for rats, and I love snakes, but most people don't, things like that, then the public won't like that. So what are some ideas, and then we can always come back and talk about this a couple months or weeks from now.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's a question that comes up every time.
Yeah.
Well, there's a number of different ways of dealing with that. Those graphics look pretty, and it makes it look like it's this gorgeous park space, and it's all manicured and everything. We know a lot of land in this parish is not like that. So in some cases, that might just be naturally preserved, whether it's wetland or, forested land or whatever that might be, for which, there's really no need to manicure it or mow it or maintain it or what have you. In other cases, it could be a homes association, but there needs to be regulations in the ordinance to ensure that there are the instruments in place that they must be responsible for maintaining that in perpetuity. So we've written regulations to that effect. You've got regulations in your ordinance now for parkland dedication. So a lot of this area can help meet some of the needs for parkland dedication, or creating linear greenways as repairing areas along drainage ditches or other things to make sure that we're filtering storm water and dealing with water quality as well. At the same time, there could be other areas where you might have a preservation, Louisiana Preservation Board or something like that might step in to maintain or manage some of that land. So we kind of, again, lay out kind of a range of different ways that this can be done. I don't want you to walk away thinking these guys are going to put a lot of acreage on a parish's backs to maintain, because that's not at all how it needs to go, because we know you don't have the resources to do that. So that land doesn't necessarily have to be, park space. It could be in some places. It could be, prairie land or floodplain or whatever that might be. And in some cases, it could even be used for agricultural purposes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wagasback.
Okay. Yeah, so I have a question that may be covered later, but I want to go ahead and ask it. So Ms. Delat mentioned that we have deficient infrastructure. Is part of this plan helping us identify those deficits, and also kind of giving us a roadmap to what it will take to upgrade those deficits to what we're proposing for the new zoning? Is that something we get guidance on in this package, or would that be another company?
It's part of the package. And an entire task 3, or rather 5, is dedicated to looking at those issues specifically, all around infrastructure and financing those infrastructure deficits and what that looks like in realistic terms and feasibility approach. It added a cost to the project. We understand that. We think it's critical. And so that part of our team, he's going to get started at the very beginning of phase 2, and be working as part of those stakeholder engagement meetings, gathering data, doing all of the reporting requirements, and then come back to the council at a couple of points in time to give you his findings on those things. It's really going to help us, though, because you can't go behind a curtain and redraft all of the zoning districts without that information. We know a lot about density in development. Our teammate is going to work a lot about the infrastructure and the financing, and so that we can come together with a coordinated approach that works.
There's a second part to this, and that's in terms of the regulations. And it's basically sequencing development. So we know, or we will know, where there's infrastructure in the ground now, where that infrastructure perhaps is overcapacity today, or where there is available capacity, and where there are planned to be, wastewater, water extensions and things of that nature that it will open new ground for development. So in the areas that are not expected to grow anytime soon, we can write the regulations for them, but then we can help you in terms of staging where that growth happens and when it happens, and not have premature development that outraces us to the fringe where we're not prepared to accept that growth. So we want to put the parish in a position of being able to guide and lead that development rather than reacting and responding to it as people are buying land all over the place and coming to you with projects that's kind of resulting in this kind of scattershot approach. So we have to be very careful about that because we don't want to stunt the market necessarily. You know, we want to be wise about that. But at the same time, we want to put the parish in a good position of developing where it makes sense, when it makes sense, and then working in a stepwise approach about where are we going and how do we get there and what's necessary to support that growth. So obviously we need to have adequate road infrastructure, we need to have adequate utility systems, and we need to think about drainage, absolutely. And are we being effective in what we have now, or what do we need to do to make sure that we're effective to hold and then release that stormwater over time?
Just one more question.
Sure.
So, just to understand a little bit too, as legislators, as we pass these ordinances and we require wider roads and things like that, what is the requirement to be, respectful of people's property and not driving growth where you want it? What goes into this? I mean, there's some kind of responsibility as you pass ordinances to also have an infrastructure improvement plan, correct?
Yes,
Okay,
and ways to finance it.
right.
Right, can we finance it or can we not finance it? If we can't finance it, then, what are our options? But we're gonna have to work with the broader community, but we can't stand there and make all the decisions. We're gonna have to understand, do a lot of research, do a lot of GIS mapping, and really work with you and work with your staff to identify those and get input from the public and make sure that they're understanding. I think it's gonna be incumbent upon all of us to educate and inform repeatedly and make sure that people are coming along with us and that they understand and explaining it to them in their terms so that they can appreciate and respect, and we can respect what they're wanting out of this too. So we all have to work together. I know it's something takes a village, right? You've been talking about that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Melanson.
Oh yeah, I just got one quick question for now. In the open space, so currently right now, all neighborhoods they have the ponds, right? The retention ponds. Would we calculate that in our quote unquote open space? We would use that. Yeah, like I'm just asking in the past if that's.
This is also something that comes up in nearly every community. It's very easy to say, give me 20% of your development as open space. And they pick a prime corner within a new subdivision and say, well, there it is right there. You're like, no, that's a hole. That's a detention pond for drainage. That's not active, usable open space that really benefits that community at large until it rains very hard and a storm comes and then it does its thing. But part of this process is to look at not only the dedication requirements for open areas, but then talk about the performance standards of those open areas. What should be counted towards them? What should not? What could be counted sometimes, but not all times? And so that's certainly something that we take into account.
I think if I understand your question, these things are not mutually exclusive. So you don't have open space that accounts for all parkland and then you have to give something else for the pond, right? That open space, when that's calculated, that takes care of the detention or retention that's needed on the site. That takes care of any buffer yards adjacent to other developments. That takes care of, boulevards or whatever that might be in that development. So that open space can be used for a lot of different ways, and that's all spelled out.
I have more questions, but I'm gonna wait to the end because I have a feeling y'all gonna answer a lot of them as we go. So I don't want to ask something that y'all mean.
We're still on the first recommendation.
Right.
Yeah. No, I'm good, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Robert.
So a lot of what y'all are saying, I agree with and I like. There's a disconnect between a lot of what I'm hearing and what a lot of the people are wanting, but I think I see some good things and some bad things here. If we start out, we're looking at 52,000 more people by 2042. Okay, that's what they're calling for in development. Now, a lot of these codes and a lot of this intensity and a lot of this zoning, we're talking about having green space, utilizing green space, and we're able to double the density of these particular areas to utilize that green space. And I think green space is great, I think it's important, but I also want to make sure it's very important that our infrastructure is going to be first before that. I mean, because we have green space all over. I mean, should we require developments to have more green space and to have it more usable? Absolutely. But for us to be able to put the density in there, I think a lot of these communities could work, and it would have to be pre-planned communities in open spaces. Honestly, the only way I could see Ascension Parish ever getting 50,000 more people in 20 years is if we were to go as extreme as we got to put half of those people on the other side of the river in Donaldsonville. That's doable, okay? We have a lot of open farmland. We have a lot of infrastructure out there. Kind of like you were talking about the sequencing of the development. You're not going to allow the development or push the development of the high density where we already have problems for the roads and the infrastructure not being there. If we were to compound the opportunity for developers by maybe creating some type of TIF district, not only would that bring developers there with incentive, but it would help the parish develop roads, develop sewage, develop lighting, and basically doing it with the people that are coming in. These things have to be set up beforehand. I feel that a lot of the people in Ascension Parish are here because of the economy. They're here because of the lifestyle. They're here because of the jobs and the work and the location. The reason a lot of people don't move to the other side of the river is because they don't know people there. They don't know places to live, and there's really not new developments there. So it would take the parish going out and having these commitments with people like River Ranch or with Conway or with those people and getting commitments with the plants and the different workplaces and schools, because they're not going to go over there without the schools in place, without the shopping in place, without the grocery stores, the churches, without all of it, the sidewalks, all of it. And the only way that's possible in the next 20 years is if we have the incentives to where the developers do it, but they're not doing it on the parish's penny. By setting up these TIF districts, we're all coming out ahead, okay? And I'm going to kind of pause from that part and go to the second side of it. The thing that concerns me is the 20-acre minimum lots. Because in the same sense, I mean, I deal in real estate, always have. You know, it's something that we've dealt with. And, I mean, you're talking about killing the value of some real estate right there if you're saying, hey, that's a 20-acre, you can only subdivide into 20-acre lots. What would be the type of lots, or how could you rationalize that value by doing that? I mean, and maybe if it was some type of industrial or commercial, but farmland's not going to get that. You know, so what would be in place to stop the extreme devaluation of land, and why would we need to go to that extent?
All very, very good points. First of all, I can't stand here and tell you today that you can absorb 52,000 more people where we're sitting today. We're talking about this idea of holding capacity. You know, when you think about what you can hold today with the infrastructure and the land that you have a certain bowl. And at some point, it's going to run over the edges of the bowl unless we add extra infrastructure to make that greater. So first of all, you know, it's a decision of the parish as to how much growth is too much growth or how fast is too fast, and we make plans accordingly. Relative to TIF districts, that's the purpose of the cost of growth study. That's one vehicle. What Carson Bice is going to point out to you are the range of different financing mechanisms that are available, the pluses and minuses, and help you make decisions about what's in the best interest of all people. So you're absolutely right. You hit the nail on the head on you know, basically every point. So regarding the 20 acres, that was just conceptual, just to kind of illustrate the idea. What we need to do is understand the real estate market, understand the lay of the land and the parcel sizes that we have now and then calibrate the model around that. So that was just to give you an idea. It may be 15 acres, it may be 10 acres, it may be 8 acres, but we're going to look at that to figure out how do we, in areas that are intended to be rural and where people want it to be rural, is 5-acre lots rural or is it not? If we split up the road size with 5-acre lots, that rural disappears really quickly. So we have to work with the parish to figure out how do we preserve that rural character, but at the same time, allow development and allow people the interest in their property to use it as they want. So that's the careful balance of trying to figure out, at some point, we have to decide if we want rural parish, then here's the way that you can develop rural preservation, here's the way that you can develop and still have a rural preserved character. So we're gonna have to work with the market, we're gonna have to work with folks like yourself and other people to understand, what are those values and what are those lot areas and to calibrate.
You kind of bring up a second point of, you said that you're going to contact and go through the community and talk to people and find out what people want. I'd love to see what that's going to look like and see how people will have the access to be involved in this type and for them to actually see the difference made. And then also, what about our utilities, our emergency, all of those different things? Here recently with Hurricane Ida is a perfect example. Something that I've wanted to push and I've talked about for forever, and it sounds a little far-fetched just looking at the big concept, but why are we still putting power lines above ground? Why can't we put all of our power lines underground? You know how much money and how much less problems and catastrophe and huge emergency that would be during storms? What type of grants would we have with that? Would we be able to get any type of grants or
Very good point. I'm sure we'll hear many other such comments through this, and that's part of the resilience and sustainability, right? How do we think most wisely about the future, and how do we sustain ourselves, and how do we recover most quickly when there are storm events? And that's one such example. So,
thank you.
Mr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's Mr. Brett? Okay. Caught my attention in your introduction in talking about communication and transparency. Was that something you installed, or was that something that's coming from the administration?
what was the question? Was that something?
Communication and transparency you talked about.
Yes.
You mentioned that earlier in
Yes.
your introduction. Was that something you installed, or was that something that's coming from the community, from the administration?
No, that's, something we brought forward. We believe in that wholeheartedly. We want to have everything above board. We want to be able to communicate. We want the information to be available. We want to be able to report what we're hearing and what we're seeing so that people understand. Like Tarek said, we don't have a dog in this fight. We don't have any interests in this parish at all. We're coming to you as that outside force, and we want to work with all of you. So we're very careful in ensuring that there's no impropriety. We're not talking to any certain people. Everything comes through the parish. We're not talking with people individually. Everything's done in the wide open. And as we are taking notes and stuff, we basically record those and we put them back out on the website so people can see what we're hearing. Same way we can accept public comment when we start drafting things, so everybody can see what everybody's comments are, so they can understand and appreciate where people are coming from. We need to work through this together. So we found in doing this for 3 decades that you have to be fair, you have to be honest, and you have to be above board on everything. And so that's why we're here, is to make sure that we're serving your best interests. So, but that we commit that to you, being transparent and above board on everything we do.
I can truly appreciate that, and that's serving that's serving both sides of the river, so to speak,
Absolutely.
west and east bank, in terms of communicating and being transparent with that. I had 2 other questions. Mr. Robert answered, talked about one of those. In talking about moving forward in the study that you all are doing here, the growth, the West Bank in itself is included, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You bet.
And we talk about, Mr. Robert talked about the 52,000 people. If that's the case, the West Bank of the river won't have any choice but to grow, so to speak. Wouldn't you say?
You say you don't have, whether or not you have any choice?
You wouldn't have a choice. If you have 52,000 more people, there's no more that can go on the East Bank, that you would have to be an overflow on the West Bank to where we can get some stuff going on the other side of the parish.
Well, as parish council, you absolutely have a voice as to how much goes where and when it goes there and how you facilitate that. You know, what's necessary was talked about in providing facilities and services and different use types to make that a community that people would choose to live. So if that is an opportunity for develop and that side of the West Bank is interested in seeing that development, you have a voice in what that development looks like. What type of development are we getting? So, you know, that's what we're going to have to work with you. Your plan says one thing. We're going to be verifying and validating the plan and making sure that's, in fact, what the parish wants to see happen in different areas of the parish. So,
And for sure, that most of this, what you're talking about is, most of it is factored in, the West Bank.
West Bank
It
is
is factored
absolutely included
into
in our,
what's going, what you're doing to,
yes,
so to speak.
yes.
Yes, and the reason I brought back up the image of the zoning map is it's very easy in a plan or in concept to say, grow the West Bank. But right now I see a lot of green on that side of the river. And so part of this process is giving you the tools necessary to achieve your goals. But then you've got an additional process ahead to say, all right, now that we have a different lineup of zoning districts, if that is indeed what you end up with, how do you map those? And how do you treat the West Bank as compared to the East Bank and anywhere else within the parish? You're going to have some additional conversations after a code is adopted to say, all right, do we rezone some of the green to something else that would give us more growth where currently it is not zoned for?
And the great thing is that you have the opportunity to really create the type of community that the parish wants on the West Bank. You've got a lot of, you know, available territory. So
Yes.
you can plan it appropriately and plan it with infrastructure and all the other pieces that come with it and do it right and do it well.
Thank you.
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the touchy word is connectivity. You brought that up early on. In other areas that y'all worked with, look, I'm not saying I want all these subdivisions connected, but we need a certain percentage connected.
Yeah.
EMS, all of our, you know, everything, fire, police, everything. Do y'all have the expertise or have y'all had it? Can y'all give me an example of what y'all have done in other areas to say that, you know, this connectivity is needed here? Right now, we have good things going on. We have turn lanes, we have roundabouts, we have different things. We have some of our roads right now are closed and people are having to reroute. If some of this stuff was connected, you know, it'd be a little bit easier on a lot of people. I just need to know if, while we're going through this process, is we need to, you know, if there's a certain one that we can make connectivity with, we need to know this and we need to start educating the public that, look, we need to do this for such and such reason.
Yeah, excellent point. We have probably 2 or 3 slides just on subdivision connectivity. But we don't have to go there because you've brought it up as a highlight, and so we'll talk about it right now. It's crucial to think about connectivity, not just from a connecting that subdivision to this subdivision, but also within and through new subdivisions. And so there's a lot of ways you can do that. One way that's pretty creative is having a subdivision connectivity index, where you literally are dividing the ratio of nodes to links. I just mean lengths of street to intersections of streets. And the more of those that you have, that give people different options of how to get around and through subdivisions and to other subdivisions, the more connected it is based on that index. And so we've worked with a lot of communities that like that approach, and they find it valuable. Sometimes they tweak the number required for those. Another great way is just to make sure that, you're having enough points of access into a subdivision, and that the distance of that point of access is within a certain distance from major arterials, and that you're not having some of them so sparsed out that you're creating bottlenecks as you go up and down a major corridor. There's a lot of ways we can do it. We'd love to give you that spectrum of options.
For a decade of my career, I worked for Wilbur Smith Associates, just now been acquired by another firm, but they are a national transportation firm. And so that's the work that we did to support the engineers. And you can look at it as subdivision by subdivision, but as you know, you've got a roadway plan, and it's a network, and we need to make sure that that network is connected. When you have a series of circuitous and disconnected roadways, and all the cars from a subdivision have to come out to a single point, you're creating a lot of unnecessary conflict points on that roadway, and you're manufacturing congestion that doesn't need to be that way, because people have one choice of how to get out of their neighborhood, and it's to go out to this roadway, and as everything else develops along that roadway, the cumulative effect is gridlock. So we need to think about how do we distribute traffic. And it's, you've got stuff in your regulations right now about arterial roadways, but then you have to have a whole system of arterials and collectors and local streets, and making sure that you have access management. So you're controlling the number of access points out onto roads. You're controlling driveways taking access out onto roads. You're requiring joint access and cross access and those types of things, so that not everybody has to get out on the major road to go around the block or to go what's in their backyard to go to the store because they can't get there from here. So this is very common. We see it particularly in parishes in large rural areas that kind of develop piecemeal, small pieces at a time with individual landowners. We have to think about that system for the whole area, and basically have each subdivision think not just within their boundaries, but how are we going to tie the whole system together, so that we have multiple options where we can go. And it's particularly important in this parish when you have flood events, as you very well know. You need to be able to have multiple ways that you can come to and from, and not just be stuck in one and you're stranded.
And it's got to be consistent between your subdivision regulations and your PUD and SPUD regulations too, so that you can't negotiate your way out of having good connectivity.
Thank you.
If I may make a comment, I'm sorry, John, I'm going to get to you, but at this point, if I don't say it now, I'll forget about it. Connectivity has been for many of us a major issue for a long time. I think I've voted for every opportunity I could to see connectivity, and I've lost every time, because folks come and they stand at that podium and they tell you they do not want traffic through their subdivision. And they even get in one case we had the sheriff here to tell us that, no, don't do that. It became the biggest, it was terrible. So how are we going to educate and change that culture in our parish of do not connect subdivisions? Because I promise you, the first time this comes up, we will have an army here to tell us not to do it.
It's hard to do this retroactively.
Yes.
Right? But going forward, when you think about the design of subdivisions now that are basically a series of local streets, everybody lives on that street and their driveway takes access to that street. So of course I don't want more people coming through here. There's safety, security, there's more traffic, there's kids, there's school zones, there's all these things. But when you think about designing a collector roadway system that is designed for that purpose, and there's not residential lots that take access to that collector, and rather they take access to a residential street, who then give them access to that collector roadway, so that you are directing traffic to roads that are designed to carry that flow. There's also concern about, going from small lot areas to large lot areas, or going from residential areas to commercial areas or industrial areas. There are some places where we draw lines. You don't want to go directly from your neighborhood into an industrial park, right? But nonetheless, we need to think about how do we create subdivisions, and we have standards that are required. And like Tarek said, we spell out in the regulations what is subject to exception under what circumstances, and what the answer is no. And if we stick to that answer, sometimes we just simply say no. We don't allow exceptions. And if we want a parish that's going to develop like y'all want, then we have to be able to have good standards, explain those standards, and apply them consistently. I've worked with thousands of developers, and so has Tarek, all over this country. Every single one of them, 100%, will tell us, set the bar where you're going to set the bar, we'll meet it. But treat us all fairly and move us through the process. Don't hang us up in long, circuitous hearing after hearing and all these extra processes. Tell us what we have to do and we'll do it. And so that's as clear as that, just writing the regulations in black and white so they can read them, say, okay, I need to do A through L. And if I do that, I have a very high certainty that I'm going to get approved, because this is what the parish wants. And don't create all these discretionary approvals and all these requests and everybody accepting out of everything. That's one of the hazards of PUDs. So we have some thoughts and alternatives about how do we deal with those types of developments.
I get that, and I want to clarify, it wasn't the most recent sheriff. I'll be getting a call from the sheriff saying, I never did that. It's never in our experience, I don't think anybody will recall an experience where it was a developer saying he didn't want to connect. That's not the issue.
Yeah.
The issue is the public does not want them to connect.
Yeah, everybody wants to live on a cul-de-sac.
Pardon?
Everybody wants to live on a cul-de-sac.
Yeah, exactly. So let's work on that. And please help us to understand how we can
And
best
we'll
do that.
illustrate a lot of these things. So we'll show you graphics and examples of how they work, and we'll explain how they work and answer questions
Good.
so that you'll understand.
Very good. Mr. Cagnolati, I apologize for jumping over you there, John.
My speaker on, please. Yes, you hit the nail on the head. We can't retroactively regulate, but I hope going forward, we're gonna have regulations and zoning that makes sense, but somewhere we're gonna have to draw that line in the sand, with respect and with fairness. But in the process, you're saying that, one of the things that you stated early on is that we need more zoning districts. With that in mind, do you have any idea when you might be able to present us with a new zoning map that would have, you said you're gonna offer options, we would like to see that, but any idea in the process when that might happen?
Well, certainly within the first few months before the moratorium. I think that is one of the perhaps most important, one of the very important things that we can do. So we start analyzing, like I said, we model all of your current regulations, so we know what open space is required, we know what rights of way there are, we know what lot sizes and lot widths are, so we can determine what densities are being achieved now. And then we start recalibrating and figuring out where there are gaps, where we need additional districts and to serve what purpose from a growth management perspective. So we usually come to you, it's kind of like what he was showing of, here's the districts in your plan, and here's your current districts, and here's the districts that we propose, and here's our approach. We like to give, as I mentioned earlier, options within those districts. They're not each a different zoning district. We can go crazy and get too many zoning districts, then we create, we burden staff, and we burden with you with all these rezoning and public hearings, so we gotta be very careful with that. But we would be doing that pretty early in the process.
Okay.
Don't you think?
Yeah, but again, just a reminder though, our job would not be to remap the parish. Our job would be to give you those options so that you can make decisions on which portions of the parish should be mapped to those new zoning districts.
That's
Yeah,
all,
we're not
Madam Chair.
proposing to give you a whole remapping of the entire parish.
No.
That's a major undertaking, which we could if you needed to, but that's not what.
Yeah, the best thing you can do is to talk about the regulations as they're being drafted, argue about the rules and how they should be improved before you've started looking at individual properties. Because as soon as you do that, then nobody wants you to move forward. They will say, nope, what about this property? Said, no, let's talk about the rules, and once we get those established, then we can move to talking about individual properties.
That's all.
Mr. Lawler.
Yes, I did read through your entire presentation, by the way, so I'm familiar with it. But one of the things I was going to ask about traffic calming. We have a traffic calming ordinance right now, doesn't get much use, but one of my goals when we moved that forward was to have that put into our ULDC or UDLC or whatever it is, to make that part of the subdivision growth. Because we have a problem all the time. We get calls, people are speeding through our neighborhood. Right now, the best answer is, okay, go get enough signatures, then we'll see what we can do, and call the sheriff. But I think if we could preemptively say that, hey, you need to put these type of traffic calming measures into this neighborhood development before it's even built, and, you know, if you have a road X long, whatever it may be, do you have experience with that, and is that something that we could move forward with this?
I'll answer that in a couple of different ways. First of all, the calls would then just go to Ricky, so they wouldn't
That's
have to
fine.
call the sheriff anymore.
Right.
But I will just tell you, before we commit to saying, let's put traffic calming in the ULDC, it may be appropriate, it may not. What you don't want to have in a zoning and subdivision regulatory document is a lot of technical engineering standards, because the engineers might want to change those standards more quickly than you want to change zoning and subdivision. And so we want to make sure, are we being consistent? If we're being consistent, which document should those standards live in? Because if you have them in both, now you've got room to be inconsistent over time and have conflicts.
A lot of the speed bumps and speed humps and speed tables and things like that are retroactive measures. If we design subdivisions properly in the geometrics of those subdivisions, we don't allow for long straightaways of wide streets.
Yeah.
Right? We require either horizontal curves, or we require offsets in roadways and things like that. So if you give people an open shot from front of the subdivision to the back of the subdivision with no parking on that street, it's going to be a speedway, right? But if we design it differently, then we can avoid a lot of the problems that we encounter. So we need to think about, how do we lay out subdivisions, how do we lay out streets to calm traffic naturally in the design of the subdivision without having to do some of these add-on after the facts.
Okay, I know that we have a speed calming procedure, and it lays out a lot of that kind of stuff, and it's not just speed bumps and stuff. It's like you said, offsets, it's widening of roads, narrowing of roads, neutral grounds. Maybe if we can make sure they get a copy of that, and y'all can see that. We also, have y'all taken a look at the master transportation plan?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, just make sure y'all have all that, and we'll get the speed
Yeah.
calming also.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, it's not all speed bumps. We don't do speed bumps, because those are horrible, especially if you, yeah. Okay, good deal. Mute mic.
Okay. Any other questions, gentlemen? I don't think so.
Well, you kind of hit on a lot of the other recommendations that we have in here. So I'm going to check through these and make sure we talk about some of them. One quickly to mention is just by encouraging additional housing types. You might say, well, how's that growth management? Well, the more options of housing that you have, the more opportunities you have to build different densities in different locations with a mix of uses, and preserving some of the character on the outside fringe and preserving that natural open land in this case. So just by adding uses to the table of allowed uses that you have now, different housing types, and describing what those are and where they're appropriate, you will actually achieve a lot in terms of greater densities where appropriate and protecting open land elsewhere. So just wanted to mention that. We've got a couple of examples that we worked on, including Zachary, Louisiana, and what you're looking at here is what you could expect in a code from us for the parish. We've got graphics and tables that show you, here's a zoning district, here's a particular housing product located within a zoning district. Here are the standards in terms of dimensional requirements for that housing product. And then we could do that for lots of different housing types. We could have standards for base zoning districts that also get into housing types too. You've probably heard the term missing middle housing. That's how you do it right here. You make sure that you knock out everything between a single family home on a lot and a low-rise apartment building, which you've thought about apartments and standards for those. I think those could be improved because there are very few requirements for those, but think about everything that could happen in between and start being creative with housing product. Incentivizing infill development, much in the same vein as just encouraging additional housing products. How do you make efficient use of existing infrastructure? So if it's really easy to do a development in greenfield, and by greenfield I mean it's never been developed before, you're making it easy to do new developments there. So they're always going to do that, right? The tricky lots are the infill lots, redevelopment lots, lots where the infrastructure already exists, but there's a reason that lots are vacant in those areas, right? They're tricky. Maybe they're tied up in ownership, brother and sister fighting on what to do with the property, or they can't get enough land put together to do the type of project they're interested in. So we get it, they're tricky. But if you can make sure the code gets out of the way of doing good infill projects, then you'll start to see some of that benefit. And again, anything you do on infill properties takes advantage of streets and pipes and infrastructure that's already in place. So how do you do that? Maybe you give bonuses in terms of density that they wouldn't otherwise achieve on a greenfield site. Maybe you reduce the amount of parking required if they can bring you something on an infill property. Anything that, and we can be creative with you to think about different incentives that you might be able to consider to make sure that you get more redevelopment and infill development. So what does that mean for the ULDC? Updating the code, allow additional uses for infill development than would otherwise be allowed. I'll give you an example that I worked on in Indianapolis. They had 500 uses listed in their table of allowed uses. It was way too many. And they had some permitted by right, some prohibited, and some where you had to go talk to the council to get approval for it. What they didn't think about was in Indianapolis, their economy was really struggling. And there were so many infill vacant lots that nobody wanted to touch for one reason or another. And the city was making it very difficult to do any development on them. So what we did is we called those vacant uses and literally put a V in the table of allowed uses to say, there's more things that you can do on those certain vacant properties than you would otherwise be able to do within that zoning district. If it's been vacant for 5 years, 7 years, you set the threshold wherever you want, we'll give you a larger menu of uses to choose from to see if we can get something on the property. Because oftentimes economic developers will say, well, we'd rather have something there than nothing. Now that doesn't mean liquor store is included in that list or other uses that are challenging, but just think creatively about how we address infill. Adequate public facilities, we've talked about this. We want to really hone in on level of service for sewer. You've got a lot of good consultants working for the parish right now. We're bringing in Carson Bice through our proposal to say he's going to look at infrastructure challenges and funding mechanisms for that. But we know that you shouldn't be doing new development where the sewer doesn't have capacity to handle it. And if you are, that's a really big problem, right? It's not just the traffic. It's where do we put the effluent from all of this new growth and development. So we want to take our orders from all of your consulting engineers that are doing their projects and make sure that that is brought into the ULDC. Brett?
You've all had a chance to look through the presentation we provided to you. Were there any pertinent sections in there that you had questions on? If there are certain sections, we're happy to respond to those rather than going through all the presentation.
So I have Mr. Molson who would like to make a comment, but I see the parish president has his hand up. He doesn't get a number on my thing over here. So, Mr. Quitmal, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, two major things, and I kind of mentioned them before. We're going to really have to dive deep in this, but we need to know specifically how that needs to be accomplished with drainage and our drainage ordinances as they relate to subdivisions. Oftentimes we see a development and then we have to spend taxpayer dollars beyond the footprint of the development to the major outfall to accommodate for whatever restrictions they have in, including runoff from the outer perimeter of the subdivision. How do these developments retain 100% of their water? And matter of fact, maybe go beyond that, maybe not zero effect, but an additional negative 10% flow outside these developments. So we need to coordinate on how we get into that drainage-specific topics, as well as, the infrastructure, how it relates to our current standards and ordinances with roads and things like that. So you mentioned we can't go back in time, which I agree to a degree that you can't, but you have the opportunity with a funding source to acquire a right-of-way and project that connectivity to where once the right-of-way is established or whatever, of course it requires a funding source, and we look forward to y'all presenting that. You talk about street connectivity, but what about park connectivity to where you have a development and it's next to raw land? Well, you want to situate that park, whether say you 10 acres, say you have 20 acres, you have 2 acre park space, you want to position it on the border so that if that other development comes in and they have to give up 2 acres, now you have a 4 acre park that two developments can share, and we don't have, one on the south side and one on the north side, and, we have two different entities. So just wanted to approach that topic of park connectivity as well. With zoning, and as we get into these numbers and specifics, it's going to be critical that we get public input. And I know that we have that in here, but we really need to make sure we have those trips that y'all take, have a certain amount of those have public input. What we don't want to do is, as a collective group, come up with all these ideas and us start to get to that point and then ask the public, and the public is absolutely no, go. And then now we start back from ground zero. So as we develop these various ideas, we want to be able to take what we all agree is where we're headed to the public and then get that feedback so that we know at the time of accepting these ordinances or changing our code that we have the public's backing in doing so. So it's going to be a critical point in getting that public input as we approach that redevelopment and infill. I think it's very important that we look at areas that may best fit that situation and look at what we're specifically talking about, how it relates to Ascension Parish, what major intersections that you may want to see more commercial or walking distant type development. So I'll be curious to identify some of that infill and redevelopment areas throughout our parish so we can kind of get a better idea of exactly what you're talking about, and then the incentives that we need to encourage that development, to have that money come from business owners into there. Maybe it's zoning, maybe it's less fees or impact fees or whatever, to redevelop that based on that circumstance. So I look forward to that. But that's just some of my basic comments. I don't want to get, because I can go on for days. So I don't want to get on too much, but that was some of my initial ideas that I wanted to throw out there. We really have to make sure we have that public input plan in place and when that happens, so that when we go to change our regulations or rules, we already have that in place and we have that public support. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Quitman. Mr. Molson.
Okay, I'm on. Thank you, Chair. One quick comment about the infield that kind of caught my attention. Look, we have blight, right? We have old buildings, 100, 150 years old, and they're vacant. And as far as density, you're talking about affordable housing. I think the average home value in our parish right now is like $258,000. It's high. It's hard to find affordable for young you know, a young professional out of college or a young family with a new baby and all that stuff. And it just made me, so there's a project going on in Coach's District on the West Bank. There's a old general store. I forget the name. Is it Lehman? Lemon. And this old beautiful building that's been vacant for decades, and they're putting apartments in it. You know, and it's right there. It's walking. They got the sidewalks and all that stuff. So I just want to comment on it because that really caught my attention. That if there's areas like this we can identify, maybe, you know, along our main corridors, like Airline Highway, you know, there's a few vacant buildings here and there. That would be a perfect spot for your higher density, affordable housing right there, and they're within a half mile basically of anything you need, you know, whenever you're in that Prairieville, Gonzales area. So I did want to comment that whenever you're looking at an old building for, you know, years and years, it gets old to look at. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
The building that Jason's talking about is right on the river. And it's close to it, walking distance.
How old is that building, Coach? 150?
At least, I would say close to, but it's in a good location, and it's very much walking distance, and it's downtown, so to speak.
We oftentimes write regulations for adaptive reuse. That is exactly for that. And as Tarek said, sometimes you got to get out of the way of that, or you got to try to reduce the number of problems that they're going to encounter. And there's a variety of ways we can do that, but you've got to make it feasible for somebody to come in and take an old building that may have asbestos or may have failing infrastructure, whatever that is, to be able to turn that into a viable project and a profitable project. So not only just how it looks, but making sure that it's, you know, can be of good utility and, safe.
What was the name of that building?
Lemon Building.
Okay.
Mr.
Wanna make sure
Turner,
we get a
if you'll
picture
give
of
me
it.
just a second, I'm going to acknowledge Mr. John Diaz, and then I'll get to you.
Yeah, real quick, and we talked about this on the Zoom call, and I just kind of wanted to see, one, if you guys had an opportunity to dig into this a little more, or if you think you can. And the slides are not numbered, but it's here. One of your recommendations is a property tax millage to buy property for stormwater facilities, recreation, and other public lands. Basically a dedicated revenue source to buy open space. And the bottom line is you can't make open space, and once it's gone, it's gone. I know in 2020, 11 states or counties in 11 states passed about $3.9 billion in revenue to preserve parks, open space, detention. And here's the thing is we always sit around here as administration is what are the things we should be doing today that in 20 or 30 years people are going to say, man, you know what, those guys were smart. Like the guy who decided to preserve Central Park in New York. That was a pretty brilliant idea, and it gets a brilliant more and more, as you get further away from the time he did it. And so even if we did that, and we had a $1 million property tax, and I'm just throwing this out there, and we bonded it for $40 million, and we spent that $40 million over the next 20 or 30 years to one, recreation, detention, and also you talked about adequate facilities. The fastest growing cost to us improving our infrastructure is right-of-ways. So then it gives us a revenue fund to start preserving corridors, which we have to do. I mean, it's, the cost that we're paying to just widen roads, and these are not really 4 lanes, it's just adding safety widen, is just tremendous. And so I don't know if you guys had an opportunity to do a deep dive in it, but at some point, can you come to us and say, look, this is what other counties do to do this? And the only reason I say it is because our library board, about a year ago, gave up a mill. So I think they were collecting 6 mills, that was more than they needed, and they gave up one. So there's a millage sitting out there that we can bond out for about $40 million, which I think goes a long way. And here's the other thing. I think it helps us, a lot of people in this administration, on this council. It's tough to tell someone you can't put your property in commerce unless we can offer you fair market value for that piece of property. And so that's really why I would just like to explore it and kind of get an idea of what other counties are doing. And I think it just goes a long way, because once again, once green space is gone, it's gone. You can't make it anymore. It's like beachfront property. So
I think after our Zoom call with you, when you initially brought that up, short answer, no, we haven't dug in extremely deep into those details, but we immediately called Carson Bice and said, look, if we're going to make a real dent in improvements, especially as it relates to future growth of the parish, we need a better understanding of funding mechanisms to be able to fund infrastructure and meet that gap and meet the need. So we've got it by mention as a bullet point. Part of his job as part of phase 2 is to really look at that with a fine-tooth comb and bring us a set of solutions to consider.
Mr. Turner.
Yes, I just have probably two questions. Now, I know you brought up the small lots, and I know since I've been on the council, we've always had the issue of every time a developer had small lots, the subdivision next to it don't want those homes on side of them. How would that be remedied with your, could you come up with some type of remedy for that?
Yes. I know I had a slide in here. I could just tell you verbally that that is often the case. So whenever you have different types of housing products adjacent to something different, you start to wonder, well, I said on paper that I didn't mind all of these other types of products, but now that you're suggesting putting it up behind my yard, I kind of care. And I want more sameness behind me. And so what's really important in a zoning code, and especially as you start mapping these new districts, is to consider the transitions and how those are designed. And so in the cases of lot sizes, you don't want to back up really dense development to really low density development. Instead, you want some sort of a transition. To oversimplify it, you would go from single family to duplex before you would see triplex development. So that triplex would abut duplex, but triplex would not abut single family. I'm not saying that's going to be the case, but just generally, we do think about those transitions, and we also think about context. As you're coming up with numbers for front setbacks and rear setbacks and side setbacks and height, make sure that they're respecting the existing context, because you might get something new next to something that's been there for 30 years. And so make sure that there's the ability to get creative in those situations where I might say, all right, even though your zoning district says you could have a 20-foot setback, this residential neighborhood right next to you has a 30-foot setback. And so you need to meet halfway. 25 is now your standard. And a lot of communities do that.
We've done everything from require that abutting neighborhoods, if they're single family, can have lots that are like no less than 85% or 115% of the lot adjacent to them. Or we have a buffer yard treatment where you're required to either preserve trees if they're on site or to establish a buffer yard to create that separation. And then there's different heights where you can say the property next to it can have no greater than 1 story taller than the house next to it. So there's just a whole range of ways we can do that. But yes, we're very sensitive to that, and we address that everywhere we work.
And the reason why I bring it up, because, you know, in this parish, there seems to always be a problem with nobody wants to hear the word low-income houses, and they definitely don't want it anywhere near them without filling this hall and fussing and hollering. They don't want that next to them. And so that was just my main question with it. Oh, I get my second question too, though. The second one was just as far as, is there any way to modify any type of existing acreage that's already been developed as far as maybe it's an older subdivision, to try to do anything to bring those more up to date?
In what way?
I guess just as far as zoning, if say some of the neighborhoods are maybe dying out, not as many people are staying in those homes, a lot of vacant houses in those areas.
Yeah. One particular area we worked in, as an example, had a neighborhood that had a lot of homes that were vacant or lots that were vacant. And it was basically dying out, dying in value. And so what we did in that particular case was to say that if you could assemble 4 lots together, 4 50-foot wide lots together to create 200 foot, we would allow you to do 40-foot wide lots and therefore get 5 instead of 4 single family, or you can do townhomes or duplexes or something like that. That was much better than the existing condition. There was nothing happening there. And the intent was to create an incentive for builders to come in and start buying up those lots and getting an additional unit or 2 or 3 additional units to make that work for them. So that's just one example of what, what we've done before in that case. There's a lot of neighborhoods that I imagine we'll find that maybe pre-existed zoning or the zoning district that is on top of it does not reflect what's on the ground. And so therefore, they're all non-conforming, and they go to sell their property or do something, and they get hung up by mortgage industry, requires a bit of variance, whatever it is. So we look at how can we accommodate existing neighborhoods on the ground without creating problems for them. So there may be an additional set of standards that apply to them. So they're able to improve and reinvest their property without having to go through a big, long, drawn-out process. Make it by right, administrative, and spell those things out. So there's just a whole host of different things that we can do in some of the established neighborhoods, whether they're stable or maybe they're unstable or on the way to unstable, and we need to kind of inject some new life into them. That's a great question. I hope I answered it.
You did.
Mr. Cagnolotti.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple of questions. We're bouncing around. I know we're going in all directions, but a couple of things that sat in my mind. The concept of residential over retail, I guess that would be considered mixed use. Mm-hmm. Is that something that has potential for Ascension Parish, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great tactic to start improving your growth management strategy. We brought that up earlier, that the more you allow people to do a host of different activities within a closer proximity, the less they have to drive out somewhere else to do those activities. Now, it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not going to work just because you have one mixed-use building on a lot. But oftentimes, the more of that you're doing within the parish, the easier you are making it to travel through and around the parish.
Okay. Let me give you an example. So I stopped by your outlet mall out here. And malls often have large parking areas, and they're usually full a week or so out of the year, Christmas time, maybe Thanksgiving, what have you. So you can think differently about what could happen there. Where I live in Sugar Land, Texas, they had a big 1 million square foot wall, thousands of parking places that sat empty most of the year. So they came in and built 2 two-story parking decks on either side of the mall. And that freed up enough land that then they came in and they created like a lifestyle center. You can add residential and you can do other things. So you can start to repurpose and create added value to properties like that over time may suffer or may go out of business. The pandemic hasn't done us any favors in that respect, even though it looks like most of those are open now, which is a good thing. So we can think about retrofitting existing development or giving them a pathway to do that if they choose to. And then also how we can, build or rebuild that in other locations. So it's obviously you have to have the infrastructure. There's some nodes where that makes the most sense, but it's giving them incentives through the regulations that make it work for them economically to do those types of things. So there's great value, and you're seeing that movement all across the country.
Okay. My last question. I noticed I've looked over the entire presentation like Councilman Lawler. There's no mission of enforcement. And I just say that, have you ever included recommendations for policies, procedures, staffing, rules for code of enforcement for parishes or counties where you've developed ordinances after they were finalized? Have y'all done that before?
Yes, we have. And we actually get at that during our iterative drafting process indirectly. We're not going to do a review of your internal procedures and say you really need 3 more FTE doing this and you're really doing code enforcement all wrong. That's not part of redoing a zoning code. However, there needs to be a reason for every word on the page as you're drafting a zoning and subdivision code. And so if it can't be implemented and administered by Ricky and his team or enforced by the enforcement team, then you might want to think about a different set of standards that could be administered and enforced. So we kind of come at it at that angle. We also always are thinking about installation and maintenance provisions. Oftentimes communities say, all right, here's how you design a fence, here's how you design a sign, and here's what's allowed, but what happens as it starts to deteriorate? And then you're dealt with a gray area that your code enforcement staff finds really challenging as to how to handle those situations.
Like maintenance standards or something like that.
Exactly.
Okay. That's
Excellent.
all, Madam Chair.
Earlier, you alluded to the fact that we had had a sizable amount of growth, 2010 to 2020, 18%. In the decade previous, 2000 to 2010, following Katrina, we had a 40% growth. That was huge. We made some strides in reducing that growth to down to the 18%. But now we've had Ida. And I think that the idea of 52,000 people in the next decade or so is realistic, because the same thing happened after Katrina. Those folks who live in the lower parishes, many of them come here to stay. And so I think that we do need to be thinking about this in terms of 52,000 people. That's not the number of people we're inviting to come. That's just realistically, perhaps, on the best calculations of the CRPC. That's realistically what we could expect. And I believe that when Ida happened, that became even more realistic. So I'm thrilled to hear that you're going to be looking at that. I love the concept of infill. I think that by right I need to hear more about, because I think by right might help us in many cases where people do not want something built on the cow pasture next to them. And those people don't think about the fact that that piece of ground that they're living on was a cow pasture. And so tell me how we could manage this growth effectively, what the by right might mean to that, and legally, I'm kind of happy to hear Mr. Robert talking about being concerned about devaluing property. It's important that we not devalue the property of the members of this community, many of them long-standing members. So tell me how we make all that work.
You start.
It's an easy question.
I mean, it's no big
You
deal.
approve the next item on your agenda?
I thought I was giving you a lead in.
Yeah, the good part about this is that we've done this over 200 times in similar environments, and we've had great success. And so we bring to you the practices that we've learned across Louisiana, across the South, and all throughout the country. And there's been great things that have been tried and failed, and other things that, have been very, very successful. So that's what we bring to you, is that experience of having worked in, many we're working in Loudoun County, Virginia right now, and in Chesterfield, Virginia, and they're just exploding in growth. They're struggling with many of the same issues. So we encounter these all the time. I think the challenge before us is right-sizing this code. We can talk about all these wonderful things all night, but it comes down to enforcement. It comes down to be able to enforce them. It comes down to staffing, all those types of things. So we can do a lot in this ordinance to reduce the amount of process and cumbersome details and steps in process and things like that. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to decide where we draw the line. How much regulation is too much regulation? What are the things that we need to control what we need to control? And if we're not willing to stand behind the other things, then let's not spend our time working on them. So that's what we're going to bring to you and say, here's the range of options. As Tark is saying, these things are more progressive or aggressive. Does the parish want to go there? Is this topic so important that we need to go there? Or we say, that's not our highest priority. We need to focus our attention on other things. By right development, in order to have that happen, we need to be very clear in terms of what's allowed and what's not allowed. And if it's allowed, what's required to make it within context so that it works within what's surrounding it. Your point you talked about, we call that borrowed space, right? Many of us might live in subdivisions, and out our back door is this beautiful, wonderful place, but we don't own it. So you have the character of your neighborhood until it develops. And then you hear they're changing the character of our neighborhood. Yes, they are. So how do we build in that character in perpetuity? That's why we think of clustering, bringing them into the center, leaving the perimeters wooded or whatever, so that they can have that character looking out their back window forever. They don't have to worry about it over their back fence developing with an industry or whatever that might be. So we will work with you and we will identify all the ways that we can help you address those concerns that you've dealt with before and spell out, here's the different ways that you can do it, which is most appropriate.
Thank you. Gentlemen, does anyone have any other questions or comments? Mr. Cagnalotti.
Y'all mentioned earlier, y'all have reviewed the master plan that is in place now. We did that not too long ago, so it's rather current. Has it been helpful? Is it going to help you going forward? Just out of my curiosity. We spent some money doing that. We want to make sure it's going to be useful.
Yeah, I mean, this type of a process is a lot different than a master land use planning process in terms of how we engage with the community, how we engage with you all and with your staff. But it is helpful. It's good to have a foundation in place by which to start from. What we don't do as part of a code update process is revisit policy, right? So we take our orders from you all, you're the parish council, and when you give us a topic and say dive in farther on that, we will do that. You can count on us to provide commentary as to whether or not a specific standard is aligned with your current adopted policies or not. But our job won't be to revisit and rehash those conversations in the type of detail that you would in that process.
Okay.
With
Thank
that being said, it's very common that we can have language in a plan that everybody will agree with. Sounds like a beautiful place. But when we start writing the laws or the regulations to make that happen, then everybody says, whoa, wait a minute. I didn't know that was going to cost me this, or that was going to require that of me, or what's next to me. So that's the starting point. So we will be verifying and validating that it could be that there's some policies that everybody agreed to, but when we actually start writing the regulations, people say, no, that's not really what we meant. We didn't understand it that way. So we're going to be kind of asking those questions, and it could be that maybe there's some policy adjustments later on. But we'll be truthful with you about it. We'll tell you these are the consequences of doing these things. And if you're willing to go for it, we'll go for it. And if you're not, we won't.
Mr. Wagsback.
Yeah, so you guys have done this multiple times, just for the benefit of the community, because this is a big chunk of money. Could we, is there some kind of, I think of case studies. Is there something that you could share or we could share with the community that shows, maybe a place you took? I'm thinking in terms of engineering, but just a case study where you show, you took this challenging situation, kind of like we were in, and where you brought it and what were the growing pains along the way, right? Because you're going to, like we talked about, there's going to be some millages or where we had to buy land, or, is there something we can point them to with Kentig Keast where there's a success story of a couple communities that you guys have done?
I've told staff to take a look at the plan that we did for Tangipahoa. And I think a lot of the writing and the analysis that we did in that plan applies directly here to Ascension. We talk about the tipping point, and we talk about capacities and things of that nature. And I think it's written in a way that everybody can understand. And then we follow that up with subdivision regulations. And then they follow that up with regulations. So I think that's, I think your staff already has a copy of that plan. I know they've been reading it, so they can distribute that to you. But I think when you read that, it'll make a lot of sense to you.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Lambert.
Thank you, Chair. I guess I'll direct this to the parish president or Mr. Compton. We headed, we have a few years out with the new high school. It's coming up on Parker Road. And I don't mean to jump in your district, Aaron, but me and the parish president, we've looked at some drainage issues. How do y'all think, with 2 or 3 years out with this new high school coming, what do y'all see as far as mix, commercial, let's face it, in Dutchtown, you have every capability to walk right down the street, get a hamburger. You know, you have the children going back and forth to the Subway. How do y'all see this helping us with this development coming? I mean, the school's coming, and these tools, are they gonna, you know, is it gonna help you, Ricky, or what do y'all see in 2 or 3 years out with just looking at the high school?
Could be different than what it is today. Today it's single-family detached housing, and perhaps you could start to infill some of that property with a higher density product so that you do get a little more walkability and things like that. You know, what we have not seen historically here in Ascension Parish are those developers who are coming to do a mixed-use vertically product. It's going to take somebody who wants to see if it'll work. You know, the Conway was supposed to be that, but it still hasn't appeared, and they've been building houses out of the ground for a while. Retail follows rooftops. It's a fact. As our land starts to run out, the value of that property is going to continue to go up. And that's when you're going to start to see mixed-use development start to come in and say, do I fit here? What uses can I get, and do I have tenants? I mean, that's where it's going to go. So yes, around the high school, you know, it's pretty well developed with single-family detached residential right now, but there's going to be parcels around that area that will be left to be developed, and at some point, yes, these regulations will help us steer that in a more productive way.
I would put that on maybe the priority list too, just to, you know, say, look, so, I mean, we're gonna have to make some type of connectivity there, plus try to keep people from going across to get different things, because look, with high schools, you have to feed after school activities, football games. I mean, jambalaya only goes so far. We've got to get other things in this mix here to, you know, keep people from driving across town.
Yeah, as far as infrastructure is concerned, what we'd like to do is get to the drainage board some possible solutions with drainage prior to the meeting, but certainly put that on the agenda item, because the school's being built. If we're going to do something in and around the school, we need to start having that discussion now as the school's being built. And as far as transportation, we're going to have to look at the intersection of Parker Road and 44. There's no turn lane there. I think that would be considered an emergency item to be looked at in the Transportation Committee. So yes, we need to start having that discussion. You're absolutely right. It's going to change our traffic patterns in Ascension Parish. It's going to put a lot of people in an area that didn't exist before as far as traffic's concerned, and as well as drainage. As schools bring subdivisions, and people are going to look to build next to them, and we got to start looking at what we anticipate that area to look like. Commercial along 44 right there in front of Parker Place. Obviously, those lots have been left for commercial. So as that school gets built and that traffic starts to add up there, those commercial lots are going to be developed into something. So we need to decide what they want, what we think would help spur that and incentivize, as well as what should go there as far as amenities that service that area, as far as, you know, restaurants or other type of things similar to what's in and around Dutchtown.
In our experience, when you find an area like you're describing here, where there's a lot of moving parts, there's a big new facility coming in, there's an existing framework and urban fabric intact with single-family residential, but you've got other ideas on the potential there, and you want to think harder about that. That's a classic case where you would do some sort of a sub-area plan or a neighborhood plan so that you can not just look at infrastructure in a vacuum and then say, we'd like more commercial there, let's do mixed use. But instead, you're doing a miniature version of a master planning area to think about all of those ideas before you just go and remap on the zoning map what you think might be appropriate there. So if that, I would just encourage you, because that's not the only area within the parish, right? You probably have several of those that are just really important. They're nodes, they're hubs of some sort, where it'd be nice to have some sort of a regulating plan in place before you make those critical decisions on zoning. But we can certainly give you the tools that you can apply there.
Mr. Robert had another question.
It's a lot of information, a lot of stuff for y'all to look through. It's a large task for us to do. $345,000 is a lot of money. I understand a lot could be done with that, and a lot of work could be there too. What are some tangibles that we're getting for this? You said that 99% of the time you get code implemented when you're dealing with these people. Obviously, that doesn't mean you get it implemented within this budget, but I want to talk about real-time value that we have here. I mean, I know you're going through unifying the code. You're going through and helping us do a lot in order to reach the public and see what they really want. But $350,000 is a lot of money for such a broad spectrum. So I guess, what are we getting for it? Simply. And I know we're getting a lot information-wise, but something tangible, like can we have some goals here? Can we have some,
I appreciate that question. As we've gone through this first phase of work, we have worked hard to really understand and appreciate where the parish is at and what the parish's greatest needs are. And we know you've got a timeline, and we've got to work within that timeline. And then doing things within that timeline, and then we're saying that there's some additional work beyond that, but our first priority is within that initial timeline. You're not just going to get a bunch of words on paper. We're going to rethink how this parish operates in terms of how it develops. We want to make sure that the predictability and certainty is elevated such that all the people on the dais tonight and all the people that are developing in this parish understand what's required of them and what's necessary to create a sustainable future, a future that you can all be proud of and the type of development that you all want and expect. We purposely brought Tischler Bice into this. We've worked with them elsewhere in the country. There's really nobody better. They've done equal number of projects we have all across the country, including Louisiana. So they're going to really help to look at the necessary improvements and the financing and the gap between that and the revenue that you have available, and how do you fund some of these things. That's a critical component of this. That's typically not part of this type of project, but it is here in Ascension Parish. So we purposely brought that in. So that's a good chunk of change. But when you meet Carson and when he starts going through this, you're going to think it's worth 3 times what he's given you, because it's going to be critical to the future.
And that brings up my next point of that is, what type of value can we look to expect in the future for having these policies and codes and ordinances as far as grants and as far as developer, putting in for community building and community growth?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. I mean, the most tangible thing you get out of this $345,000 is a new development code that respects all of the hard work that you've already put into it. I mentioned you have a good starting foundation, so we don't have to throw everything out. Some of it is poorly written, some of it is inconsistent, internally inconsistent, some of it is inconsistent with other policies and ordinances that you also have on the books, and everything's listed in an appendix. We put it together in a package that you can understand, staff can understand, the public can understand. We put it up on an online interface. Your developers come in, they know exactly what's expected of them. You have very good criteria laid out for decision making. That's a point we haven't even talked about yet. When you're making a rezoning application in the future, here's the 9 things you need to consider. And it's very black and white. That's tangible. right? Make your jobs easier to make good decisions for the parish so that you're not fielding phone calls about why you made a bad decision. Bad decisions are made because you don't have a way to say no right now.
Is there a
And
way
you're
that
fighting
we could,
your way to say yes.
is there a way we could possibly write the code to where we can encourage more Dollar Generals to be built?
Well, we can,
That's all I have. Thank you.
For a moment of brevity.
you just,
If-
yeah.
I'm going to take a comment from the parish president, and then I'm going to call item number 5 so that we can move along. Mr. President.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so, you know, as Mr. Councilman Robert stated, it's a lot of money, and we all know that. But with that being said, we don't have the tools in our administration to do this. We simply don't. We chose Ken and Keist when we initiated their original contract because they're experts in this field that we don't retain. What it would cost us to go and hire these experts would be monumental, and then have them on staff forever. So, you know, I think the biggest challenge for us, and that's all of us, is to take the opportunity and do something with it, because we're going to dictate how we grow for the future based on this information, and that's critical. And so we need to hire the best experts around that have done this over and over and over across the country to ensure that we're knowing what other counties and parishes, not only in the state but across the country, are doing, what they've experienced, because they're experiencing many of the issues that we are. So it is a lot of money, but for us to do it internally is way more than this. And I don't think we could get the expertise, even if we tried, for years and years and years to try to get to that level of expertise that this particular organization has. So you have to consider it every time when you're spending this kind of money. But I can assure you that we just don't have the resources internally to do it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Lawler, and I'm going to take 2 more questions, and we're moving on to item number 5.
Actually, Mr. President.
If we're going to, and exactly, if we're going to continue to talk about the contract, why don't you all let me move on to item number 5?
Well, why don't we move on to item number 5, and then I'll make my comment. That
Okay,
works.
we've got to, how about that for a compromise? Twice in a week.
Thank y'all for the presentation.
Thank you, gentlemen, so much. What an amazing way to look at all of this. What an opportunity for us to have all our comments heard, and certainly you will be giving the public an opportunity also to make their comment. So item number 5 is the approval of a Keist contract amendment in the amount of $345,494. It's a Phase 2 implementation and code update. Chair would entertain a motion to move
Motion and-
I have a motion by Mr. Lawler, second by Mr. Cagnolati, and the floor is open to Mr. Lawler for questions.
Yeah, and we kind of touched about this a second ago. I want to commend the parish president and his team for going out and finding y'all Keist. I always want to say Keating for some reason. I apologize. But I was thoroughly impressed with the presentation and what I expect to get out of this. And I think this is fantastic. The parish president also answered my next question, is the administration supportive of this? Because this is a collaborative approach between the council, between the public, between the administration, and y'all. We have to make sure everybody's in support of this. And what I hear the administration is, I hear the council is, I think this is going to be great for the public. So I was very happy to make the motion, move this forward, and I look forward to this. Thank y'all.
Mr. Melanson.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I do remember, so back in March, we actually, we took a trip to Harris County and we tried our best to meet with y'all because John Diaz found y'all on his black, web that he finds everything on. He's like, hey, man, dude, they got this place.
All this information.
Yeah, Kinder Egg there, and they're in Sugarfield. But, no, and look, I'm a big fan, and I agree. We don't have the resources. Our ULDC is such a hot mess because every 4 years, different people sit up here, whatever kind of best suits, their preference at that time. We need a unbiased third party to come in here, give us factual data to make the best decisions going forward. So I do support it. I do have one question. This is going to be for or legal, Mr. DePatty. So I know our parish ordinance, the original contract, I believe, was 35,000 ish. So our parish ordinance allows us to extend this as a piggyback to the original. I just want to make sure that state law, professional services, that we're good.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
our law piggybacks to state law.
Okay, perfect. I've had that question a lot, and I've had it myself, so I just wanted that out there. But no, I'm very excited. Thank y'all. I can't wait for this. I would encourage any information, any constructive criticism that we can get, before our moratorium is up, or as a panel, if we discuss and like, hey, maybe it's worth extending this a little bit more if need be. So just anything we can kind of get on that front end would be greatly appreciated, because it's 18-month project, which, roughly the last 13 months of y'all's project, 12, 13 months, give or take, a moratorium will have expired. And so that's a pretty big gap for us to continue where we've always been, and we're working so hard on improving our ULDC. So I do ask for that and encourage just anything we can get on the front end is appreciated.
Just to be clear, we intend to bring you an ordinance for your consideration and adoption before that moratorium is up.
Perfect.
So we're going to identify, here's the top 6 things that are our biggest issues and we need to work on now. And we're going to tackle that in this next 6 months. And then we will proceed on with the rest of it.
Okay.
So we want to basically try to help solve your problems within that time frame, so you don't have to keep kicking it down the road.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay?
That is remarkable. Mr. Cagnolati.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a comment to echo what Councilman Alonso said. We're hoping that what we accomplish, in all seriousness, we don't have to worry about the next administration or the next council. It'll be in place. It shouldn't require any other, minor tweaks here and there maybe, but not any major overhaul and renovation. But the only question I have is in this $345,000, whatever dollars, is that considered your not to exceed quote, that you'll have the deliverables with the code that you'll give us options to choose from, but that includes everything.
Yeah, it's a maximum not to exceed amount. There was a couple options in there that if you choose to add them on, then that would be extra, but otherwise, what we spelled out in the basic services is a maximum not to exceed amount, yes. And we'll invoice month by month as we draw down those funds and we deliver product to you.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Wagasback. Oops, excuse me. Coach Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm listening and hearing, I heard the president talk about the experts, and you're talking about the experts and coming and getting things going. I'm very concerned that we allow ourselves to, West Ascension is a part of the parish in itself, and we always come up because we're on the other side, and we need the growth. And he mentioned about the experts, getting the experts in to get some growth, some development. What would it take to get that started on the West Bank and getting things moving to where it would be so much great that we have the entire parish growing and not just one side of the parish that's growing and moving some things around and getting these experts in. We've talked about this for many, many years about moving the West Ascension forward, and we've been lacking in that area. And the East Bank has been growing tremendously, and on the other side, it hadn't been so fortunate. So with the experts getting in and allowing us and letting us know what we need to do or what needs to take place and how we need to do it, and just getting that done, it would be so much better and you have the whole parish in itself fluctuating. And with that, with the West Bank not doing as we should or we should be, we still are the #1 parish in the state of Louisiana, one of the biggest parishes. So with that said, hopefully we can get that done. Thank you.
Appreciate your comments.
Mr. Wagasback.
Yeah, so I wanted to go back to the timeline and kind of address what Ms. Delat asked earlier. Do you guys have any experience? So when you're up against a timeline with a moratorium, do you guys have experience, like if we do have to extend it or alter it? You know, do you guys have any experience in that? I know, I don't want to say it was Tangipahoa. I'm going to look at John Diaz and ask him, was it St. Tammany they have like very specific moratoriums? I think it is a Tangipahoa? Okay. So, I don't know, I was just going to ask, do y'all have any experience, if you get up against that timeline where we may be in the existing moratorium, but there's a couple items we need to finish up on, and we write it a little differently. I mean, it's just a general question. I don't know. I have no experience with it, so that's why I'm asking.
We have laid out a scope for you to finish the interim deliverables within that time frame.
Okay.
We don't intend to go beyond that time frame unless you tell us we're going beyond that time frame,
Okay.
or unless there's some major disruption that doesn't allow us to finish within that time frame. We need to work with you and be honest with you about, how many things are on the table and what are the most important and prioritize, because we can only do a certain amount of work in that time period, right? So we need to tackle the biggest issues, and then we'll proceed right on and finish them. You mentioned after the Katrina and Rita storms, that was right when we worked in Zachary. Same exact thing. They put a moratorium. People were coming into that place and developing things that they didn't want to have happen. So they did a moratorium. We did an emergency ordinance, and we wrote a lot of regulations to address multifamily was one of them, and there's 5 or 6 topics. And we adopted those and then got out from under the moratorium, and then we continued on for another year beyond that and did a full unified development code. So yeah, we've done this in many other places. Sometimes we can do interim codes in lieu of moratoriums, but in this case, you already have a moratorium, so we're going to work within that time frame.
And just one thing to tack on to that is that you would know long before we got to that sensitive time frame if there were ever an issue. We tend to over-communicate as project managers. Ricky can tell you, we talk to him probably more than he would like, but we're going to have those discussions. If we bite off too much at the beginning and realize only 4 of those 5 things can get done before that moratorium runs up, they're going to know with plenty of advance notice.
Okay. Thank you.
So at this time, I don't see any further questions, so we will, the chair there's a motion.
Y'all can keep your proposals under 20 pages. It takes a while to read all of that. That's a little excessive.
Smaller font.
And we haven't done this vote in here for a while, so let's start the vote. And Mr. Lawler, are you going to vote? I'm trying to. Yours is not working? There you go. Very good. And I was headed to end the vote, and as is obvious, there are 10 yeas and 1 no vote. So thank you all very much. That motion passes.
Motion to adjourn.
Have a motion and a second to adjourn. That motion passes too.